Let me first say that I organized the 9th International IDEA Conference at Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania, US in 2011. So I know how much work goes into organizing this kind of conference. And I want to thank Mario, his helpers, his supporters, for doing such a terrific job with organizing this 10th International IDEA Conference, and also with respect to celebrating IDEA's 30th anniversary. So thank you, Mario. This has been terrific. Now, on to the job of introducing Dave Crocker. I first got to know Dave when the philosophy department at Bryn Mawr College, where I was for many years, invited him to give a talk. That was around 1997. He gave a talk on insiders and outsiders. And I was impressed then and have been influenced by his work ever since. Dave also introduced me to IDEA. My first conference was in Honduras in 2002, and I've been at almost all the IDEA conferences ever since. Dave is obviously a true and important mentor for many people interested in development ethics. I don't need to tell you much about Dave's research and his impact on development ethics. That was well covered by Jay Drydick and Lori Kelleher on the first day of the conference, when they inaugurated the David Crocker lecture series. And also with Luis Camacio's excellent presentation that covered the importance and areas of research that Dave has been working on for many years. So I'm going to go right to turning it over to Dave Crocker to give his talk. He tells me, just so that you get an idea of what's going to happen, he tells me the talk's going to be about 45 minutes. He wants me to warn him with 5 minutes left so that we have some time for questions. But we are going to aim to end very shortly after 5.
My topic is development ethics in a new key. Borrowing a title from Susan Langer, who wrote a book called Philosophy in a New Key, in which she tried to say we're not rejecting the old, but we're finding a harmonic departure from the old that will be in a new key and have different melodies and different issues, as well as a resonance with the past. I think we should maybe invoke Jefferson again, who said that every 30 years there should be a revolution. And I'm not calling for a revolution so much with respect to IDEA as a rethinking of new challenges in a new context. And we have many new problems that have emerged, and I'll be focusing on about 4 or 5 of them. But I want to start with the idea of development ethics in the old key, meaning by that I think we began our approach to development ethics because of some of the great achievements of Costa Rica. And I came here after the 1984 conference with the idea that this would be a place where hope is being kept alive, that we have much to learn from Costa Rica. A tiny country, but a powerful country in terms of its achievements and its influence. I might say that it took me a while to become adapted to this country. This morning I walked by a gas station that played an important role in my first couple of days here, because we were living about a mile away, and I was trying to get to my office not far from here for the first time and not realizing how far it was. And about halfway there I discovered that I had to make a pit stop. I had to find a bathroom, a toileta, a baño, and I couldn't find any. And I ran faster and faster and still couldn't find any. Finally, right around the circle up here, there was a gas station, and I I went in and in my, I hope improving Spanish at the time, I said, ¿Dónde está una sala de caballeros? Thinking that a men's restroom would be what you would ask for. And the response was, aquí no hay caballeros. Here there are no gentlemen. I won't tell you the end of the story, but I did have to retire the pantalones from active duty. So what we found here, what I found here, and what my colleagues in the end of that wonderful sabbatical year, Fulbright year of 86 and 87, was a peaceful, democratic country, distinguished from its neighbors by democratic elections, by democratic parades, by a social safety net, by minimal corruption, by convivencia, and many of you have heard the expression por vida. ¿Dónde está? How are you? Por vida. And I learned a little bit about what that might mean as a way of praise and living together. And also a country of football, of soccer, which I was not only involved in, but I think learned more from Costa Rican football and from what happened in the cancha, in the pitch, than I did in the classroom. You know, Camus has a wonderful one-liner. I have a T-shirt that says it, Albert Camus. And by the way, an Algerian French, right? Multiple identity. Whatever I have learned about ethics and morality, I've learned in the soccer field. We learned that Costa Rica, in contrast to its neighbors, you always say, talk about Central America, except for Costa Rica, a kind of exceptionalism. Success in reducing poverty, a long tradition of education started in the 1880s. A couple of dictators that lasted about 18 months in the 1918, 1919, the Tinoco brothers. A civil war that lasted about 2 months. Everything in Costa Rica is done on a smaller scale. And a firm commitment to rights to basic satisfaction and citizen participation, and even citizen participation in the context of deep disagreement. It's always typical of Costa Ricans to be on a panel with a Marxist on this side and a libertarian on this side, and to be friends and to shake hands. It's like my first soccer team. I asked the kids at the end of, these are first graders, what they liked about soccer. Shaking hands with the other team afterwards. And a philosophical tradition of public engagement. Página 15 in La Nación. It doesn't exist anymore as Página 15, at least there are op-ed pieces, but it used to be a place where many of my new colleagues would be writing articles, and I thought, wow, that's great. Philosophers should be engaged with public issues. And IDEA's first conference kind of celebrated some of these achievements. And we did, as we have here, included other disciplines, policy people, and political actors. And I must say I do miss having, say, a representative of the Bribri Indians here, as we did in one conference in Honduras, and a representative, not just scholars about social movements, but representatives of them. But we did have other political figures like Rodrigo Carazo, president from what, 78 to 82. And activists like Joe Stuckey from Monteverde with the Quaker community of development. And there was much mutual learning. And as we're going to be doing in the next 2 days, we had a site visit to Peace Corps and to other kinds of development projects. We felt we had to get out of the classroom and into the field and learn from those that were struggling. And hear the ghost of Dennis Goulet, of engaging with communities of struggle was important to us. By the way, we did have a group of executive board that returned to Costa Rica in 1995, now about 20 years ago, to take stock of where we were and where we ought to be going, and we made some decisions there that may have to be remade. We decided that we would be less a big organization and more a small organization that would be mutually supportive of our own individual work. And now I think we realize that our interest in not being co-opted by the mainstream may have limited our success in engaging not only with the mainstream, but with the most exciting social movements of the day. So very quickly, we found some limitations with the Costa Rican model, and I must say if we had looked more closely, we would have seen that Costa Ricans were seeing limitations with their own model at the same time in '86 and '87. We tended to focus too much on Costa Rica as an island of peace, an island of agreement, and not recognizing the impact of other countries on Costa Rica and of the United States on Costa Rica. I remember vividly talking to an Afro-descendente, an African descendant on the Caribbean coast in one of my favorite towns in Costa Rica, Puerto Viejo. And she was cooking a fish in coconut oil. And I said, are you from here? And she said, no, I'm from Nicaragua. And I said, oh, did the Samosistas and the Contras kick you out? And are you getting away from them? No, I was getting away from the Sandinistas. And that didn't fit my view at the time, where the Sandinistas were unqualifiedly good. I think it's also clear, as we saw in the first presentation this morning by the three women, the lady that had to leave early, that there already were resistances to what you all call neoliberalism. That's a word that gringos have a hard time with because we know there's free market liberalism and we know there's Franklin Delano Roosevelt liberalism, and they're very different. And so we're never quite sure what neoliberalism is, but I remember marching in 1986 or 1987 against the International Monetary Fund that was imposing a view of privatization, of limited government, of dismantling the social network. And already that was going on. And I think there is something in the presentation this afternoon that Costa Rica is at a new turning point, where social movements of various kinds are not only more active, but are in some way joining hands to make a movement more amplia. But what we left out when we looked at Costa Rica, or what we were shaped by, was so many countries in the world are not like Costa Rica. And of course we should have known that by looking at its near neighbors, but states with internal conflicts, deep internal conflicts, with civil war, with cultural heterogeneity, with authoritarian repression, with global and regional impact upon Costa Rica, in some way supported by the Reagan administration to be a showcase for free market liberalism. I did have the privilege of interviewing, with the help of Luis Camacho, Don Oscar Arias, and what we talked about mainly was when he came to power, the first day he learned for the first time about a U.S. airport in the northern part of Costa Rica and viewed this as an infringement on Costa Rican autonomy. And we talked at length about that. So Costa Rica was not disengaged from the larger issues of the day and became in some sense a pawn in the late stages of the Cold War. Also, I think we emphasized too much the the vision part of development ethics and not the empirical, policy-oriented, data-collecting dimension, or what Desde calls the observation dimension. Now, that's not to say vision is not important. And one thing I learned from Manuel Formosa, another one of the great team of philosophers here at the University of Costa Rica, is that without a vision, it's difficult to evaluate the steps and strategy that you want to be taking. But the truth and the skepticism about visions, I think, is that we need to constantly revise, refine, challenge, criticize our visions so that they'll fit in different contexts. To turn from vision is to turn to the means and the processes. Development ethics, as we began to define it many years ago, was ethical assessment on the ends, the means of development, but also now I would add the processes by which decisions are made and who should make them. I think we also were, the Costa Rican model influenced us too much in the direction of what my old colleague William Galston called going with the grain instead of going against the grain. There are times and places when each is important, but I think we went too much with the grain. And I think one of the things that we've seen in the last few years is that we've been so happy when some of our ideas have been taken up by the World Bank or by international, by the Inter-American Development Bank or the Asian Development Bank or by the UN, and have kind of been proud that we're making an impact, only to find out that the intellectual content, the sting, the critical dimension of the concepts were watered down, were sanitized. So as we think of going in the direction of a new key, it seems to me that we need to realize that in some sense the Costa Ricans themselves have been looking for a new key. And I did my final paper before I left in 87 was to look at 4 competing models of development in Costa Rica. And I think that the Costa Ricans have continued to be self-critical and to look for a way to go forward. There are many new topics as we look around the world. Security, that Des Gasper has mentioned. And I might say that in the trip to Morocco with our 18 graduate students and undergraduate students from the University of Maryland, our topic was the ethics of security and democracy in Morocco. Bringing together security, development, and democracy, and I'll be trying to do that later. Global warming is something that was not on the radar screen before. Migration, immigration, and we just got a start on that yesterday, and I think we have to do more. Thanks to Jay Drydyk and his colleagues, the migration that's caused by big development projects is being scrutinized from an ethical standpoint. But you Costa Ricans with NICAs coming down, young NICAs, and we gringos with Mexicans and Hondurans and Guatemalans flooding it, we need to have a public and national debate about this and try to figure out what the options are and what the best solution would be. Also, social media. To what extent is it a breakthrough, ethically speaking or democratically speaking, and to what extent is it a new instrument of repression? Because the military government in Egypt also uses the social media to increase its ability to repress. It seems to me that there are 5 new topics that we need to address in addition to the ones that we've already heard, ones that I felt have been absent from this meeting. And like in Nigel Dower's presentation on fair trade, I don't think everybody has to do all of these, But some of you who are looking for an important topic to pick up on as we move forward may find that this fits your interest and your competence. The first one is that of transitional justice. How should a society, or within a society, a state, or within a state, a municipality, respond to great evil that has occurred in the past? Should it ignore it in the interest of moving on? And I know that there are still in Spain some families that can't talk about what happened between 36 and 39, or between 39 and 75 when the dictator died, because the families were divided. On the other hand, as some kinds of illnesses, what is repressed now may come back in the future. And even the Spaniards, although they have lots of other problems, are beginning, at least on a local level, to find out who is buried where and what might be done to recognize. And of course, they already have a huge monument to the dictator in Madrid, right? My student, Matt Regan is interested in the connection between memory and development. Truth and Reconciliations Commissions are one way of dealing with the past. Trial and punishment, reparations, various kinds of artistic reenactments. We talked a little bit today about some cultures of silence. And in Bali, there was a horrible massacre of more than 1 million people when Suharto came to power in 65 and 66. And anybody on the left, communist, socialist, whatever, was massacred. And some of you may have seen the new documentary, The Act of Killing, which is a reenactment by some of those involved with great gusto, proud of what they had done. But for many, many years, nothing was said, especially in the island of Bali, where some of us have had the privilege of visiting, except through dance and art of various kinds, keeping a memory alive and trying to deal with them. I think the issue of reckoning with past wrongs is a development issue. You can't go forward without, in some sense, going backward. And it may be that the future is the past, because if you don't deal with these things, you're going to have them continually nagging at you and undermining what you might be able to do in the future. So transitional justice is important because often we have to decide between, for example, trial and punishment, which may polarize the community, which may set people against each other, in contrast to finding some other way of dealing with the past that will enable people to move ahead to a better, more authentic development for the future. The second topic, it seems to me, that we need to deal with, and this has been mentioned in several ways, is the issue of inequality, the nature of inequality, the causes of inequality, the types of inequality, and the ways of combating inequality, and the limits to those methods of combating, because some inequalities may be perfectly justified, morally speaking. And this raises the larger issue that I fear that we are not doing enough ethics in the context of what we might call political economy, of understanding how power is distributed right now, why it's distributed the way it is, how it might be distributed better. These are all empirical issues. And then the ethical issue comes in, how should it be distributed, and who should decide these matters. We know that Thomas Piketty is a rock star now, raising the question of the origin of inequality and the changes in inequality from an old kind of discrepancy between the rich and the poor to a new kind of inequality. Is he right? What are the implications of his view for evaluating the global structure, national policies, local policies? It would be interesting to have a Piketty or someone representing his view laying out his diagnosis, and then, as Des came with input and output, looking at different kinds of solutions to the problem that he identifies. The question of governance, it seems to me, to be crucial. And I fear that we've ducked that too much. Development does not take place in a vacuum. Thomas Carruthers at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, in his most recent book, is arguing that development can be and should be inherently political. There is a temptation, he says, of the technocratic, of the technical. Well, we're going to bring just a credit union into Nicaragua. But if you bring a credit union into Nicaragua in the Somoza era, that helps Somoza gain credibility that he's doing something good. And maybe instead of bringing in, you should join the Sandinistas. Well, should you, when you know what happened to the Sandinistas? My own view is that they did not resist the temptation of power. The question of who should decide the issue of inequality of power and who should decide solutions to morally defective inequality, I think leads us to the third topic, and that is democracy. I don't think we can avoid the problem of not only who does decide, but who should decide the questions of democracy, of development. That's got to be just as much on the agenda as the ends that we're seeking and the means. Who should decide these things? And I appreciate Jay Drydeck's reminding us that for Dennis Goulet, there is some sense in which the non-elites should be front and center. In spite of what we might call adaptive preferences, there may be something about their, if not wisdom, at least their insights into their own suffering, into their own interests and their own needs that needs to be brought to the fore. But to do this, we have to reconceptualize both development and democracy. Still, for many people, development is economic growth. For many people, democracy is elections. And I must say that there's a backlash now against democracy, understandable, because my former student, who happened to be president, invaded Iraq with the idea of promoting democracy. By the way, he got the lowest grades in his class. A class that emphasized Plato, Descartes, Hume, Kant, and Nietzsche. I still have the great book to prove it. We do have a new rival on the development horizon, and that is beneficent authoritarianism, which is raising its ugly head in various places. There's a new book called Competitive Authoritarianism that sees that an authoritarian structure can use democracy in the sense of elections, even fairly free and unfraudulent elections, to justify its place in power. So I think that we need, part of our job here is to look at China as a non-competitive authoritarianism, and look at Nicaragua, for example, as a competitive authoritarianism, in which controlled elections provide a kind of moral camouflage for domination. A fourth topic, it seems to me, we need to deal with is that of pluralism, in relation to democracy, of marginalized people in relation to democracy. some of the work of Will Kimlicka and his colleagues over the years of trying to make a case for the rights of minorities seems to me to be an important step in the right direction. Jay Drydeck mentioned the notion of cultural liberty. And to what extent might we have, should we have a society that is pluralist, and what are the limits of pluralism? In Morocco, you can't be a citizen if you're a Christian, let alone if you're an atheist. Although you can if you're a Jew, and of course a Muslim. The Jews and Muslims happen to be expelled from Spain in the same year, and they have some alliance because of that. In Israel, a full citizen has to be Jewish. It has to be a Jewish state. Why not a one-state solution in which anybody, regardless of whether they're Palestinian or Jewish, Muslim or not, can be a full citizen? How does one accommodate diversity? And here Morocco is interesting because of the role that the king, in this case a top-down role, which sometimes takes place, in opening up opportunities for the Berber, for the Amazigh community. Although many Berbers believe the king has not gone far enough, they now have an official language. Berber language, Amazigh language is taught in the schools. They have radio and TV stations. And yet, it may be too little and too late, or a kind of sellout. That remains to be seen. And here I would mention Monique DeVoe, a young philosopher in Canada, and Stacy Costco, who has looked at this issue with respect to the Roma throughout Europe, and the Laplanders, or Sami, in the Scandinavian countries. To see what progress is being made, what limits there are to the progress, and what might be a better way of accommodating minorities in the future. And of course there is here a problem of minorities within minorities, because often a minority group will have dominance of males over females or whatever, and that needs to be faced up to, something that Will Kimlicka has been worried about. The topic that I want to spend a little more time on, and not just identify, but to make a little bit of progress on, is the issue of corruption. So many things in development don't work because of some kind of corruption. Our Turkish friend and I spent a long time talking about the variety of corruption going on within Turkey. When we first started trying to evaluate Peter Singer, we were worried about the idea that, well, we're supposed to give this money or food to people in Bengal, and yet we find out later that before it got to the people that need it, somebody stole it. And it may even be somebody part of the poor community that did the stealing. And what we find, I think, on all levels is that corruption in some way is antagonistic to development. But you know, we avoided this issue of corruption. I can remember in Argentina being on a television interview, oh, you do development ethics. Well, what should we do about corruption? Duh. Why did we avoid it? Because it's so easy to be a finger-wagging moralist and say, naughty, naughty, mustn't do. And we didn't want that. We wanted development ethics to assess policies and structures and ideas and practices. Well, it turns out that corruption is a practice with taking many different forms in many different contexts. And it needs to be understood and evaluated. And there may, in fact, be a role for moralistic finger-wagging at some point. Only a month ago, I was asked to give a lecture in Peru at a Jesuit university, and it helps to have rectors who have had philosophical training. By the way, were you as impressed as I was with the rector here that gave such a informed and politically and ethically sophisticated presentation and challenging us? I won't say anything about the rectors and deans at the University of Maryland. The occasion for my being invited to give a lecture was something that occurred in Ancash, the richest state of the many states in Peru. What happened? A political killing foretold. 3 years ago, the representatives of the current governor of Ancash, or president of Ancash, broke into the home of a political rival, tried to kill the political rival, wounded him, and killed his son-in-law. For the last 3 years, that political rival has tried to bring legal suits against the governor without success. At every step in the way, he's found resistance, and it's getting clearer and clearer resistance because of payoffs and bribes and influence of various kinds. Even in the national parliament, a bill to deal with the question was not allowed out of committee or was voted down. This particular governor had lined his pockets with contracts for building. He had made lots of money. He had the police in his pocket. The newspapers in Ancash never reported what was going on or criticized him publicly. The political parties were silent about this. Why? Their lives were in danger, or their livelihoods were in danger. This was an event that kind of stirred up. How could this happen in a country that's supposed to be on the road to development, to beneficial social change? And then it turned out that there were as many, on the day of my lecture, there was an article in the paper with pictures of 28 people that were suspected. Now, they should have put the pictures in. They weren't found guilty yet. And in another nearby state, another governor was found guilty of embezzlement. So here, the outsider, what do I know about Peru? Brought in, and all I could do was to kind of say, here is an issue that we all have to deal with. And I started by talking about the corruption in Prince George's County in Maryland, where we live. And the former county executive is now serving 8 years in jail, and his wife serving lesser time because of embezzlement and kickbacks and fraudulent dealings. And by the way, a salacious detail here to spice things up a little bit at this time of when the police arrived, she had $80,000 stuffed in her bra. Now there's some question about how that could happen, but that's another issue. Fortunately, we have a new county executive who has taken cleaning up the mess as part of his approach, but he also has a very subtle and complex vision about education and employment and civic engagement and safety in the schools and better education, so that corruption is only one part, anti-corruption is only one part. Why do I always have so much trouble with Apple? Bear with me till I... There was a time when the World Bank didn't deal with corruption either. Why? World Bank's not supposed to deal with political issues. It's supposed to just deal with neutral economic issues. Bullshit, right? You can't separate the economic from the political. And finally, the World Bank realized that, and they said, well, we'll deal with corruption because if you got a corrupt society, you don't have economic growth. Non-corruption was only a means to an end. It wasn't anything more than that. But at least it was on the radar screen. But again, we have to be careful, as many of you have seen with UNDP or the World Bank or whatever, that just because they take up a topic doesn't mean that they do it justice. As recently as the World Cup, of course, we're also aware that corruption is not just a governmental issue, but occurs throughout society. In fixing partidos amistosos, friendly games, before the World Cup, in qualifying matches, too. But during the World Cup, with respect to FIFA's selling of tickets in an illegal way. I think that development ethics has to address corruption. How to do it. And let me just offer a few ideas here, and here's where I think we need 5 minutes, yikes. One of the most interesting books that I'm working on right now to kind of deepen my understanding is by Michael Johnston, Corruption, Contention, and Reform, The Power of Deep Democratization. And by deep, by the way, it means deep in the sense of drawing on the energy of all layers of society, especially the marginalized and those that have much to lose by corruption. And deep also in penetrating anti-corruption efforts, penetrating institutions and processes. So what is corruption? One nice working definition is abuse of public roles for private benefit. But that doesn't get us very far because we have to talk about what is public and what is private and what is benefit. But it gets us started. And here I think we want to say that in some sense FIFA is a public institution and that it has enormous consequences for many people and enterprises who are private in some sense have a public role to play, and that's where professional ethics and business ethics may come in here. Corruption has to do with power, and it also has to do with who should set the limits of power. It has to do with the issue of governance and what kind of power is legitimate and what kind is not. It's very tenacious. It doesn't go away very easily, and it's chameleon-like. It can change its form from one society to another. But I think it requires a normative view of the state, which has power, perhaps not a monopoly of power, as Max Weber thought, but enormous power. And what kind of state? What kind of use of power? And what do citizens have a right to expect of the state? And where does consent come in? Jay Drydick touched on this very nicely the other day. And by the way, some of you know, I think that this is a weak spot in the capability approach. Although in the most recent book, Dres and Sen have done a better job than earlier with a kind of political economy and a defense of certain democratic structures and a realization of the problems of corruption. I think Martha Nussbaum has a long way to go at this point, although we need to debate that. In some sense, corruption is the tip of an iceberg. What causes corruption? Why is corruption a bad thing? Some economists see it as a nice lubricant to keep the society going smoothly. But at whose expense? And who decides this? And I think maybe the basic problem here comes back to the inequality issue. There's something about corruption which requires a kind of non-level playing field. an unfair playing field. Here I think Johnston's work is important because that unlevel playing field can take different forms in different contexts. And here I'll just briefly indicate 4 what he calls syndromes of corruption. And notice here we're just not going to be talking about corruption, types of corruption, like types of authoritarianism and types of democracy, some of which betray the ideals of democracy altogether. A most obvious kind, and I know I'm running out of time, is official mogul corruption. Think of Tunisia, think of Egypt, with a monarch or a jefe maximo in charge, and the whole state is in some sense his state. And small groups close to the monarch, and this to some extent applies to Morocco with the king and the Maxen, the ruling elite behind him and with him. They use the state to enrich themselves. And here we might see China, Kenya, Suharto's Indonesia, Tunisia, Egypt, and I'm afraid not just the Egypt of Mubarak, but the Egypt of the contemporary rulers. Another kind of syndrome of corruption would be what Johnston calls oligarchs and clans. Here there's not one group or one leader and his followers, and maybe his family, running things. There are elites competing with each other for wealth, for power, in a climate of very weak institutions. Think of fragile states now, with opportunities for enrichment, but also with risks. And think Russia, Philippines, perhaps Mexico. And here the use of bribes on the one hand, but always the lurking use of violence on the other hand. Another kind of corruption that he identifies as elite corruption. In a moderately strong state, state institutions, elites kind of can collude together. They're outside the state, unlike the mogul kind, but can use the state to benefit themselves and to stave off any rising competition. This might be political, bureaucratic, business, military people, using the state for their own ends. Very different kind of, and here think maybe Italy, maybe South Korea, or at least at a certain point, Botswana, Argentina. And then you ask, well, what about the kind of corruption that went on in the United States, perhaps, in 2008? And here Johnston sees what he calls influence markets. In a society that's fairly institutionalized with respect to the market, with respect to the state, there still can be private wealth that seeks unfair influence over both the market and politics. Now, maybe some would call that corruption, but it may be that we have to expand our notion of corruption to see unfair practices where an elite of some sort is able to dominate the rest of society. Now, according to Johnston, and I'll get very close to the end here, there's diverse ways of combating corruption, and he sees it as a long-term political process. We might mention right off the top of our head an economic approach which would say, let's get more competition. A legal approach which is, let's get rid of discretionality and have more specific laws and punishments. A business approach which would say, let's increase people's wages. But all of these seem to be kind of cosmetic and not get to the real root of the problem. By deep democratization, and I'll quote here, Johnston says, lasting corruption control requires deep democratization, not building democracy in an electoral or constitutional sense, but rather enabling and encouraging citizens to check abuses of wealth and power through political advocacy of their own interests. And it's deep in the two senses that I mentioned. This requires increased pluralism, opening up safe political space, reform, activism. Some of you have identified some of those today. I, however, would like to correct Johnston or supplement Johnston in two ways. I think drawing on people's interests and concerns is important, but some of those interests and concerns are moral interests and moral concerns, and not just individual or collective self-interest. Here, Jane Mansbridge is good at seeing that we need both an articulation of interest and a recognition of fairness. And I think a commitment to moral decency. And one of the initial notions of corruption is a corrupt person. And there's something about moral force in a society that needs to be addressed. Our international institutions like Transparency International are an attempt to grade countries, and yet they don't take into account the differences of corruption and how different devices are needed at different times. And here some kinds of democracy can be opposed to or can contribute to corruption. If you have an election too soon and too early in the wrong way, it may contribute to corruption rather than not. To conclude, I want to return to our now outgoing president, Asuncion St. Clair, and her last paragraph. I'm going to change it a little bit, not to focus on climate change, which I think is extremely important, but to focus on corruption and these other issues. I restate the critical role of development ethicists in engaging with, for her, climate change research, for me, corruption research, assessment, and combating. I am aware of the urgency and risks of climate change, corruption, are not so obvious to many. But I wish to emphasize that this is the most pressing challenge for our generation. I would say one of the most pressing challenges. In particular, all of you who are at an early stage of your career, and I see many of you still surviving our 3 days of talk, can make important contributions by exploring some of these or other issues I have not addressed yet. There is still a window of opportunity to change trajectories, to reinvent local and global strategies, to rethink what we are and what we are not, what are and what are not aspects of mal-development, of anti-development that motivated the early thinkers of IDEA to create a new arena and area of interdisciplinary work. Thank you very much. Unless I can't remember 1 and 2 while I'm thinking of 3, but that's
Okay, so what we're going to do is collect 3 questions, and then we'll see where we're at in terms of the time. Mario tells me that we can go to 5 after that kind of latest. Okay. Questions?
Well, thank you, David, for your presentation. You mentioned among the topics we should be dealing with democracy again. One of the main topics in your writings. Do you see any potential conflict between representative democracy and deliberative democracy?
Thank you.
Usted habló sobre algunos enemigos del desarrollo, como la inequidad, el autoritarismo competitivo y la inequidad. Max Neff tiene una frase que es la economía debería servir a las personas y no las personas a la economía. Considera que esa forma de entender el desarrollo como crecimiento económico infinito, que al final de cuentas es letal para el medio ambiente, considera que esa visión hay una ruptura de parte de las personas que gestionan las políticas, de parte de los organismos institucionales, organizacionales, internacionales. Considera que ya hay un límite con esa visión de desarrollo, crecimiento económico. ¿Qué pasos se pueden dar para esa ruptura?
Third question. Okay, we've got, this will be the third question. We'll collect the last.
Yes, it's working. David, may I suggest a number 6 that I was waiting for? And that is, as so much of, I think, economic, political analysis has come to recognize the complex relationship between society, politics, culture, and religion, it strikes me that I've heard some very good papers here about the way in which religion can be a force impeding effective development and a tremendous force promoting effective development. It strikes me that that's an area that is ripe for much more exploration.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. Luis asked about the relation between representative democracy and deliberative democracy and whether there were times when they could be at odds with each other. I'd like to also add participatory democracy here. By participatory democracy, what I mean by it is that kind of small group activity where people in a face-to-face way decide on rules under which they're going to live. And that's in contrast with representative democracy, where they would be electing someone to represent them, who then in another forum would make rules under which all would live. I think deliberation can occur either in a local face-to-face context or in a representative body, where the representatives, instead of just shouting at each other or having their preferences aggregated by a mechanical majority wins, actually give reasons and debate and try to find some common ground. And when the vote comes, it's at the end of a process in which they can learn from each other and arrive at something better than what they started. So it's clear that deliberation often doesn't occur in a representative democracy. It's also clear that deliberation can be compatible with representation. In participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre as the kind of poster child case, the local groups deliberate, then they elect someone to the next level where there is in turn deliberation dealing with citywide issues rather than neighborhood issues. With respect to economic growth, I think the question really is close to what many people would say. Development is for many, many people still around the world, and Des Gasper made this point several times, it's still defined as economic growth. Everything else that comes in is brought in only as a means to economic growth. Now, and Laurie Kelleher in her dissertation tried to show how so many of the other concepts get diluted and instrumentalized in relation to economic growth. And I think you're right. The problem that many of us have with economic growth is that development should be for people rather than people for development, right? I think the revolution in thinking that Amartya Sen, but others like Paul Streeton and Mubab el-Haq tried to bring about, is that development should be aimed at human beings. It should be people-centered. And whatever it is, and economic growth may be an important means to something else. What else? For me, equal well-being and agency, but other people can fill that in other ways. With respect to religion and development, I think you're right. Like many things, including democracy, religion is a mixed blessing. I tried to make room for it in my list with respect to pluralism and the importance of people being able to live together using their agency to decide whether or not they're religious and what kind of religion. But it's clear that religion has resources that may aid and also present obstacles and impediments. And that's where we have to be contextual. There are resources within Islam that Fatima Mernissi has drawn our attention to. But we also know there are some anti-democratic dimensions. And by the way, I think as we look in the next 5 years, one of the sites that we need to have a conference is in an Islamic country. Whether it be Turkey, whether it be Morocco, whether it be a country with a strong Islamic population, we still need to come to grips with exactly that kind of issue.
Thank you. Margaret, I saw one more hand. Should I take that question?
I would say yes.
Okay, Des had his hand up. Okay, go ahead.
Dave, you called your talk Development Ethics in a New Key.
I'm sorry, a little louder.
You called your talk Development Ethics in a New Key. The list of 5 topics that you gave us, though, seemed to me relatively long-standing topics, and what I found more new was what you said before that, about the way we do or try to do work in development ethics, those sort of methodological and strategic standpoint things. And so I was looking for issues of methodology or broad intellectual strategy, such as linking to psychology, linking to well-being research, or linking to what I try to do, political discourse analysis, or so methods and strategies.
Sure.
And it's just an invitation to, if you have anything you'd like to add on those methodological issues.
Here I think I'm basically in agreement with much of what you're trying to do, and I think what Dennis was trying to do, to get development ethics upstream at the beginning of scientific research in the selection of problems. Very few people worked on corruption as a scientific issue to understand what it is, what its causes are, what its consequences. Rose Ackerman in 1999 was the first serious economist to kind of deal with it. Now we have Johnston, who's much more interdisciplinary. I think Johnston's on the way of getting conceptually a more refined notion of what corruption is, and is disaggregating the causes. Now, I'm not a social scientist, but I can be sensitive to this kind of fits my reading of the situation and the importance of political economy. So I'm buying into a particular approach, but also criticizing Johnston because he relies too much on interests and not enough on passions and commitments. And here it seems to me that when we get to the end of the line, a lot of people throughout the years have been concerned not only with poverty, but also with other forms of misery and of powerlessness. And we feel that we've been advantaged and we ought to do something about it. Those are emotional or non-cognitive, or maybe cognitive in a different sense, kinds of, I like the word commitment here. And then I think we need to raise the question, and this may be a psychosocial question, of how that kind of commitment can be nurtured and crystallized and protected. Here I'd also call attention to one way to get a handle of this methodologically is the work of ethnographers. It seems to me that ethnographers and novelists can tell us a lot more about what moves people, what inspires them. And I would suggest to all of you the book by Catherine Boo on a squatter village outside of Bombay, Mumbai, and the human face of aspirations, of failure, of corruption that occurs there, and what might be done to come out of that. And interestingly enough, again and again in the book, Ambedkar's words of, I want to be sure to get it right. Resist, educate, and organize, right? But we need to look at the ethical issues involved in those strategies and tactics, as Dennis was very much aware of. Because lurking in all of them are ethical issues that we can't get away from. By the way, the political economy, I meant to mention this, that I'm most excited about right now is done by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, and the book is called Why Nations Fail. And the argument there is they fail because of exclusive economics, leaving out many people, and exclusive politics. Inclusive politics and inclusive economics, and the most obvious kind of inclusive politics is a democratic governance in which everybody under the regime has the opportunity to participate in the formation of its rules. By the way, I might also say here, I think we need to return to the issue of, especially in a pluralistic society, how could somebody be loyal to a pluralistic regime that does not represent in some dominant way one's own religion or one's own ethnicity or one's own class? How could one be loyal? And it seems to me there's a young political philosopher at Princeton named Anna Stoltz, and Anna is developing the idea of liberal loyalty. Liberal in the sense of recognizing that we all as agents have the right and the responsibility to work out our own view of the good life and to share it with other people. But because we live in a society that protects that, we can be loyal to it and be proud that we're part of a interreligious, pluralistic community.
Okay, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of this session and the last plenary for the day. So I'd like us to thank Dave Crocker for that.